Hello everyone, my name is Phil and welcome to UAP Revisited. In this video we're going to be talking about the wave of UFO sightings that took place over the US the entire year of 1952. When I first decided to make this video, I was really focusing on the Washington DC sightings where the city was pretty much being buzzed by UFOs in the summer over a couple of weekends. But as I looked deeper into it, I realized that it was really the entire year that had a ton of activity in the skies. So today we're going to take a look at the entire wave, kind of the numbers, see exactly what was happening out there, and look at a couple of the more prominent sightings and cases, and get a few details that we can out of those. I'm not going to go too deep into each of them, this is more of a general overview. Okay, let's get right into it. In 1952, the United States Air Force received more reports of unidentified flying objects than it had collected during the previous several years combined. They came from civilians, commercial pilots, military officers, radar operators, engineers, and scientists. Some described distant lights, others involved formations of apparently structured objects, several produced radar tracks, photographs, or even video. Many were eventually attributed to aircraft, balloons, astronomical objects, or just insufficient information about what someone was seeing. Others officially remained unidentified. The sightings rose during the spring, accelerated in June, and reached an extraordinary peak in July and August. The events of Washington, D.C. became the most famous part of this period, but they were only one part of a much larger wave. The Air Force ordered the creation of its first formal UFO investigation in December 1947. The program, designated Project Sign, formally began operating in early 1948. Sign was followed by Project Grudge, which generally concluded that the reports resulted from conventional objects, mistakes, fabrications, or psychological causes. By late 1951, senior Air Force officials had become dissatisfied with the existing investigation. It was reorganized under Captain Edward J. Ruppelt at the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. On March 25, 1952, the program was formally redesignated Project Blue Book. Blue Book's purpose was not to prove that unidentified objects came from another world. Its primary objectives were to determine whether the reports represented a threat to national security and to collect enough reliable information to identify what witnesses were seeing. Reporting forms were improved. Military intelligence officers received instructions for interviewing witnesses. Radar reports were forwarded to technical specialists. Astronomical and meteorological explanations were checked with outside experts. Just as this new system was being introduced, the number of reports began to rise. Statistics later assembled for Project Blue Book, Special Report Number 14, recorded 1,501 sightings for 1952. The study listed 23 reports in March, followed by 82 in April and 79 in May. In June, the number rose to 148. Then came July. The official total for that month was 536 reports. August produced another 326 before the number declined to 124 in September. Of the 1,501 reports evaluated for the year, 303 were placed in the category designated unknown. This did not mean that the Air Force had determined the objects were extraterrestrial. It meant that the available information was considered sufficient for analysis, but investigators could not confidently associate the report with a known aircraft, balloon, astronomical object, or any other conventional phenomenon. Many other reports were identified or categorized as having insufficient information. Captain Ruppelt later placed the beginning of what he called the Big Flap at approximately June 1st. On that date, Hughes Aircraft Radar Test Crew in the Los Angeles area reported tracking an unusual target. According to Ruppelt, the target initially behaved like a conventional aircraft. It then appeared to accelerate, climb rapidly, descend, and level off before disappearing from the radar display. The crew checked its equipment, contacted Edwards Air Force Base about experimental aircraft, and examined whether unusual atmospheric conditions could have produced a false return. According to the information given to Blue Book, no explanation was established. This was only one radar case without a corresponding visual observation, but it arrived as reports were increasing across the country. By the end of June, Blue Book was receiving reports from military bases, civilian observers, and radar stations. Ruppelt wrote that 149 reports reached the project that month. The challenge was not simply their number, it was their variety. It involved single witnesses, others were reported from more than one location, some involved radar without visual confirmation, while others involved visual observations without radar. On July 1st, reports arrived from several locations along the East Coast. Near Boston, 2 F-94 interceptors were sent to investigate an object reported by a Ground Observer Corps spotter. The fighter crews did not locate it. Separate witnesses in Lynn and Bedford, Massachusetts, reported seeing one or more elongated silver objects in the same general area. One witness was an Air Force captain. Later that morning, radar instructors and students at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, reported 2 unidentified targets. According to Ruppelt's account, some members of the group also reported seeing bright objects where the radar indicated the targets were located. That same day, a physics professor in Washington reported watching a gray object remain in one area of the sky for several minutes. These reports do not prove that the same objects traveled down the East Coast, but their importance is that the unusual reports were already arriving from multiple eastern locations before the major Washington incidents began. On July 2nd, Navy Warrant Officer Delbert Newhouse was traveling with his family near Tremonton, Utah. Newhouse was an experienced Navy photographer. When the family noticed a group of bright objects, he stopped the car and filmed them with a 16mm camera. The footage shows several bright points moving against a blue background. One eventually separates from the main group. The film contains no clear structural detail. Without reliable distance, the size and speed of the objects cannot be determined from the images alone. Air Force and Navy specialists examined the film, and it was later shown to the CIA-sponsored Robertson panel. The panel considered sunlight reflected from birds, possibly gulls, a plausible explanation, and recommended comparison tests. It did not establish that identification conclusively. Newhouse maintained that the objects had appeared disc-shaped when he had first seen it at closer range. On July 14th, Pan American World Airways pilots William Nash and William Fortenberry were flying a DC-4 south toward Miami. Near Newport News, Virginia, they reported seeing 6 bright objects approaching at high speed. The pilots described them as disc-shaped, glowing red-orange, and traveling in a tight formation. 2 additional objects reportedly followed the first group. The observation lasted only seconds, but both pilots provided detailed accounts. Blue Book considered possible explanations involving aircraft, meteors, and reflections. The case was ultimately placed in the unidentified category. The report involved 2 experienced pilots, but without photographs, radar confirmation, or reliable distance measurements, investigators could not determine the object's actual size or speed. 2 days later, on July 16th, Coast Guard photographer Shel Alpert photographed 4 bright patches of light through the window of a lab at the Coast Guard Air Station in Salem, Massachusetts. The image became official Coast Guard photograph 5554 and was widely reproduced. It is an authentic government photograph taken by an identified photographer, although that does not establish what appears in it. One proposed explanation was that the lights inside the room had reflected in the window. The position and appearance of the lights made this a serious possibility. Photographs should therefore not necessarily be presented as confirmed evidence of physical objects over the station. It is a documented image of unidentified lights with a plausible optical explanation. On July 18th, 7 military witnesses at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida observed a series of amber-red lights. One light was initially suspected to be a weather balloon. A balloon was in the area, but the personnel tracking it reported that its position did not correspond with the observed light. Additional lights appeared, and witnesses reported changes in direction that did not agree with the prevailing winds. Radar did not detect a corresponding target. Blue Book's December 1952 status report classified the incident as unknown. It occurred just one night before the first major radar incident over Washington. Washington, D.C. At approximately 11:40 on the night of July 19, air traffic controllers at Washington National Airport detected a group of unidentified targets on radar. Additional returns were reported on the airport's control tower radar and by personnel at Andrews Air Force Base, although the timing and correlation among the different observations were not complete in every instance. Some pilots and ground observers also reported unusual lights. Air Force interceptors were sent into the area, but no definitive interception occurred. 1 week later, during the night of July 26th, unidentified radar targets were again reported around Washington. F-94 interceptors were sent into the area. One pilot reported seeing several lights but was unable to identify them. Other air crews saw nothing unusual. The Air Force later proposed that the temperature inversions and other atmospheric conditions had produced misleading radar returns. Visual reports may have included stars, meteors, or aircraft lights observed under unusual conditions. Some radar controllers disagreed. They argued that the returns did not resemble the weather-related effects with which they were familiar. The Washington events were not only perfectly coordinated radar and visual observation, they were a collection of reports made by different observers and using different systems over several hours. Atmospheric effects remain plausible for some of the radar returns. Whether they account for every reported observation remains uncertain. Between the two Washington weekends, 2 Air Force colonels flying a B-25 near Carson Sink, Nevada, reported seeing 3 silver objects. According to Ruppelt, the objects approached the aircraft, passed it, and disappeared from view. The colonels described them as bright, metallic, and shaped somewhat like discs. The observation was brief, and no photographs or radar records were obtained. Blue Book did classify the case as unidentified. The witnesses were senior officers familiar with military aircraft. Even their experience could not supply the missing measurements of distance, size, and speed. The case combined credible testimony with incomplete evidence, a pattern found repeatedly during this wave. Blue Book's records indicate that the wave reached its daily peak on July 26, when the project received 43 reports. The small Blue Book staff was overwhelmed. Reports had to be checked against aircraft movements, balloon launches, astronomical data, and weather conditions. Publicity almost certainly contributed to the volume. Newspapers and magazines had covered flying saucers throughout the year, and the Washington headlines gave the subject even greater visibility. Public attention can cause more people to watch the sky and report objects that they would normally ignore. It can also encourage mistakes and hoaxes. But publicity does not automatically explain every case. Several important July reports occurred before the Washington stories dominated the press. Some involved military personnel, professional pilots, or radar operators. The sightings and the publicity probably reinforced one another. Reports generated news coverage, and coverage produced greater public attention and additional reports. The wave did not end with July. On August 1st, ground radar near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base detected an unidentified target. 2 F-86 fighters were directed toward it, and their pilots reported visual contact. One pilot attempted a photographic run and reportedly obtained a weak return on his radar gun sight. The photograph showed only a small, indistinct image. Blue Book Status Report Number 8 initially classified the incident as unknown. Ruppelt later wrote that an investigator reconstructed it as 2 conventional objects mistakenly connected into one event. An unidentified low-flying jet produced the ground radar track, while the fighter pilots visually encountered a weather balloon. According to this reconstruction, the radar stopped operating at approximately the same time the pilots reached the balloon, creating the impression that the radar and visual observations involved the same object. This case demonstrates why an early Blue Book classification should not always be treated as a permanent conclusion. The wave was not limited entirely to the United States. Ruppelt reported that Blue Book also received accounts through American air attachés in England, France, South America, and elsewhere. Most foreign cases were not investigated because the project was already overloaded with domestic reports. In September, unusual objects were also reported during NATO's exercise Main Brace in Northern Europe. Several stories have since been grouped under the Main Brace name, and not every later claim is equally well documented. One confirmed incident occurred on September 19 when Royal Air Force personnel reported an unidentified object. Years later, the British government stated in Parliament that no object had been identified during the inquiry. This does not prove that unknown craft were monitoring the NATO exercise. It demonstrates that official concern about unusual aerial reports extended beyond the United States during the same. On July 29th, Major General John Samford, the Air Force Director of Intelligence, held an unusually large and widely reported Pentagon press conference. Samford acknowledged that the Air Force had received reports from credible observers describing relatively incredible things. He also stated that investigators had found no consistent patterns suggesting a threat to the United States. Behind the public response, the CIA had begun examining the subject. The CIA's concern was not necessarily that UFOs were extraterrestrial. Officials worried that a flood of reports could overwhelm military communications, conceal an actual hostile aircraft, or be exploited by an adversary. In January 1953, the CIA-sponsored Robertson Panel reviewed selected Blue Book cases, including the available photographic and motion picture evidence. The panel concluded that the evidence did not demonstrate a direct national security threat. It believed that most reports could be explained by ordinary objects or natural phenomena, and that the additional cases would probably be resolved with better information. but it also identified the reporting phenomenon itself as a potential security problem. Its members recommended reducing public interest and improving the recognition of conventional aerial objects. The military response therefore shifted increasingly toward managing the volume of reports and their effect on military and public communications. No single explanation accounts comfortably for the entire wave. The official files contain reports attributed to aircraft, balloons, stars, planets, meteors, and unusual radar propagation. Other reports contain too little information to evaluate. Publicity, increased awareness and reporting, improved Air Force procedures also meant that more reports entered official channels. At the same time, a smaller group of cases resisted straightforward identification. Some involved experienced pilots, military officers, radar personnel, or multiple witnesses. That does not make those reports extraterrestrial. It means the evidence was not sufficient to establish a conventional explanation. The wave may therefore be best understood as several overlapping events: a major increase in public attention, a more active military reporting system, numerous ordinary objects observed under unfamiliar conditions, radar and atmospheric effects that weren't always easy to interpret, and a remaining group of reports that couldn't be resolved with any of the available information. Alright everyone, that's all I got for this one. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to learn more about any of these particular cases, or sightings, leave a comment. I'd be happy to try to put something together and go deeper on any of these. The DC stuff in particular has a lot of information there. When I started getting deep into it, I realized it was going to be impossible to keep this around the 15-minute mark if I really tried to give all the information of what was going on. But aside from that, thank you very much for watching. I look forward to making the next video. If you can, please like, comment, subscribe, all that. I'm trying to get this channel going, and that would really help. Until the next one, this has been UAP Revisited. Thanks for watching.